But I believe that by overwhelming majority in all the Americas, you and I, in the long run, and if it be necessary, you and I will act together to protect, to defend, by every means at our command.
Welcome to the History in Motion podcast, where we discuss leaders, their decisions, and how they shape the world we live in today. Welcome to the History in Motion podcast, where the past comes alive with vivid tales and insightful analysis. Today, we journey back to the dawn of the 20th century, a time of empires, revolutions, and figures larger than life. Our focus is Kaiser Wilhelm II, the last German emperor and king of Prussia. A man of contradictions whose reign from 1888 to 1918 saw incredible technological change, cultural flourishing, and yet the devastating descent into the Great War. In this episode, we peel back the layers of this enigmatic leader. Was he a reckless autocrat, a puppet of his own administration, or a misunderstood monarch caught in the tides of change? From his turbulent childhood to his strained relationship with European cousins and his ultimate abdication, we explore the decisions that shaped the empire and the world. So join us as we step into the opulent halls of his dynasty, where the echoes of his decisions still reverberate through history. This is the History in Motion podcast.
Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of the History in Motion podcast, where today we're going back to World War I and looking at one of the most prominent figures from that period, and that's Kaiser Wilhelm, who is basically the last emperor of Germany and someone who had a really, really key impact in the start of World War I. And a lot of historians will sometimes point the finger at him and saying he had a very large role in kicking everything off, pointing him as this evil German, but little did they know that title wouldn't last for very long. So we'll kind of learn a little bit about him today, and specifically around the decision that he ended up making at the end of World War I to abdicate the throne and basically admitting Germany's defeat in World War I. We're not going to focus so much on making the decision in that critical point, but we're going to talk about all the things that led up to that point, because he has a very, very interesting life, and Germany is really going through this transition. And you can see just like small things that keep building up until eventually the disaster that's World War I for Germany. And eventually his hands are basically tied and he has to abdicate the throne. So that's what we're going to focus on today and kind of take you through his life up to that point.
Yeah, I think it's going to be a very interesting episode. I feel like even when we study World War I and its origins, we talk about Kaiser Wilhelm II as this figure that's, obviously pivotal in, the alliances and the lead up to World War I. But most often, at least I don't recall in any history class that I ever took in like grade school or, pre-secondary, where you actually are able to get into like the intricacies and the complexities of the ever-changing European landscape and alliances, and are really able to get a full picture of how pivotal a role he actually played.
It's so true, right? Because I think with World War I, we kind of breeze over it a lot when it comes to history, just because, it really is part one of this major war that ends up being wrapped up with World War II. And so I think a lot of times, we just kind of breeze over it and say, yeah, there was a lot of this and a lot of that, and there was a lot of death and a lot of big battles, and everybody didn't really have a good time with this war, and a lot of people died and it was terrible. But there are a lot of key characters in this and key figures. And I think with the lead up to the war, we don't even really focus on that too, because it also kind of focuses on, we look at World War I as this lead up into World War II.
Yep.
And then, when we look at Germany, we think of Hitler. And it was funny, as I was doing my research, it reminded me of a Simpsons episode for any fans out there, where they do a Halloween episode and these guys come back and they say, we've recruited the most evil German of them all. And you're expecting to see Hitler, and they're like, it's Kaiser Wilhelm. And so it's a funny joke in the Simpsons context, right? To your point, Richie, of we don't really think about him as this big evil German, where he's obviously nowhere close to what Hitler is. But he is, when you say who's got blood on their hands and you start looking at numbers, his name comes pretty high up on that list, because of, if you blame him as one of the key reasons that World War I started, it's not a really good resume to have.
Yeah, and I think that's going to be the interesting part of this, right? We'll actually get to go a little bit deeper than the surface level, which most history kind of wraps its fist around, just to be able to kind of elegantly be able to speak to the complexities of World War I, because, as much as we can kind of put a neat little bow on our understanding of the alliances and why we went to war, the Black Hand, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, and boom, there we go. The Great War is kicked off. There's a lot more complexity behind the scenes. I think this episode will not only teach us a lot about Kaiser Wilhelm II, his leadership, his decision making, his personality, but also kind of provide an insight into the background of the ecosystem that he's kind of operating in.
Yeah, I think that's a good segue you've made there in terms of the ecosystem, right? Because we're really starting to see a change in technologically from a warfare perspective, but Germany's becoming an actual country for the first time. Monarchies are really starting to shift away from an absolute monarchy to more of a constitutional monarchy. Parliaments are being created, prime ministers are being elected. Democracy is really starting to take form in Europe at this time. So this is very different, and you will see a lot of how Kaiser Wilhelm has grown up into this world by these older generals and emperors who have kind of seen a more spectacle-based warfare, like around the times of Napoleon, to whatever World War I ends up being is this, much more of a gritty type of, trench warfare that is not glorious or glamorous in the way that war had kind of been seen in the past. So I think there's a lot of interesting things we'll see here. And it's, at a time like this, you need a really, really strong leader to take you through this massive transition in the world. And unfortunately for the Germans, Kaiser Wilhelm isn't the man for the job. But I think, Richie, you kind of wanted to start us off here about giving us a little bit of an overview of those changes and what Germany has become at this time.
Yeah, 100%. And I think, for our listeners, a lot of the themes that we're going to be talking about, obviously we're kind of confining them to this regional perspective of Prussia and what will become a unified Germany. But many of the themes really do exist on a much broader scale. Obviously, they have their own kind of color and flavor, depending on which region you're looking at. But a lot of them could be pushed out, across the globe in many ways in terms of what's going on in this time period, more broadly speaking. But before we get into kind of the more, broad swaths of social, technological, scientific change that's happening, it's probably worthwhile to kind of discuss Prussia as an entity before we kind of get into the more detailed part of the episode. But, Prussia it's an interesting name. It can be a bit misleading for those who, aren't necessarily, amateur historians, but it essentially originates as a small duchy in the 16th century. And a duchy is essentially a small region that's kind of seen over by a duchess or someone who is kind of a small kingdom in many ways. But it emerges as a European powerhouse under the Hohenzollern dynasty. It's elevated to a kingdom in 1701, and it expands its influence through military prowess, notably under Frederick the Great. And maybe that's a future episode, Paul, that we can throw in our backlog in the 18th century. The 19th century sees it kind of humbled by Napoleon, as we discussed previously, but kind of reborn through sweeping reforms, and it kind of sets the stage for Otto von Bismarck's masterful unification of Germany by 1871. So by the time Wilhelm II's reigns begins in 1888, Prussia's kind of they're peaking as a bit of a leading industrial military force in Europe at this time. But as we'll see, his kind of autocratic and militaristic approach to policy creation, which inevitably would lead to World War I, would lead to his abdication later in 1918. But I think the important part here is that, it ends up being dissolved by the Allies, but it plays a key player in European history. And much of this has to do with kind of the extensive family ties of Kaiser Wilhelm. And this is one of those interesting points of this period that I think really gets to show you how integrated and involved everybody is, and, how these different leaders are kind of connected. So he has a tie with several European monarchs as a result of the practice of intermarriage, which we talked about here before on this podcast, among the different royal families, which plays a very complicated role in the geopolitics of this time. So he's the eldest grandchild of Queen Victoria of the United Kingdom. He's closely related to British royalty, including his cousin, King George V. Despite these familial connections, his relationship with the British royals is often strained and marked by rivalry and misunderstanding. And this is something that kind of comes to light later in his life when he's kind of making his geopolitical decisions and policy making, which we'll see later. But an example of this, just to kind of provide some foreshadowing, is the naval arms race that would occur under Wilhelm between Germany and Britain. He's also related to Tsar Nicholas II of Russia through his mother, who was the daughter of Queen Victoria. So again, the family bond at this point does little to ease kind of growing tensions between Germany and Russia, which grew increasingly at odds over territorial and political interests in Eastern Europe. So if you take in to consideration, the very vast, complicated political alliances that exist at this time, then you overlay an even more complicated tension of familial connections, you really have like a powder keg, which really, in an ideal world, you might see as a source of unity and peace, but instead it kind of becomes this tangled web of nationalistic and imperialistic ambitions between family rivals.
The way I like to look at it is, think of any family dynamic, people getting mad at people for whatever reason, fights at the dinner table. Think of that, but give everybody 1 million plus men and guns and cannons and tanks and weapons. And that's essentially what Europe is. It's a big family that's kind of spatting with each other, plus having all these different influences in their ears. And it really becomes a powder keg. And there's a lot of blame, like I kind of said at the beginning, of, Kaiser Wilhelm is responsible for World War I. There's all of these like little things that are happening, and it just kind of took one spark to kind of fire everything off. And it probably would have happened anyways without some of the decisions that the Kaiser made. But yeah, it's just fascinating as you kind of talk to that, to be, related to Queen Victoria, to related to Tsar Nicholas. These are the 3 most powerful countries in Europe.
Exactly.
And they're all related in some capacity. So it's an interesting just kind of dynamic that, we just don't think about it today at all. Like, even by the time we get to World War II, it's like, Hitler's not related to Churchill and to Mussolini, right? Like, it's a completely different world. And I think World War I was that kind of final piece that everyone was able to say, okay, this system's really not working in the way we thought it was going to work. And that's just kind of how everything comes together. But man, it's crazy that just everybody's related to everybody. And we've talked about it before, but it just gets weirder and weirder every time you mention it.
Yeah, no, it's fascinating. And I think it's one of those things that are sometimes it's like overlooked when you're talking about this time period or just history in general. But I think this era is so uniquely kind of defined by it, because it really is this kind of political strategy that's used by monarchies to be able to kind of spread their influence and power. But, as we'll see, it becomes increasingly ineffective as the broader kind of geopolitical landscape takes place and takes form. And I think it kind of leads me to my next point, which is there's a lot of different themes and things that are emerging in this point in history, which really do take away from that strategy of familial relations and kind of this monarchical rule, this is a period that's marked, starkly by nationalism, imperialism. So we're talking about the late 19th and 20th centuries. You're seeing a surge of nationalism across Europe. Germany is no different. And it often manifests in aggressive foreign policies and a desire for territorial expansion. Countries like Germany, which are newly unified, they were keen to assert their power and prestige on the global stage, which then leads to, something that we've discussed on here, which is the scramble for Africa. So during his reign, European powers were actively involved in the colonization of Africa. It's often called, the scramble for Africa, but it's driven by a mix of economic interest, strategic considerations. Also, you throw in the sense of racial and cultural superiority, and everyone's kind of vying for their place in Africa, and Germany's no different. So under Wilhelm, they acquired colonies such as what today would be modern-day Namibia, Tanzania, Cameroon, and Togo, and they often engaged in very brutal methods of colonization.
Well, it's interesting you talk about the scramble for Africa, because I remember all the way back when we did the King Leopold episode, part of this whole summit to kind of divvy up Africa into all of these different colonies was, we should do it now before we all go in as European powers, so we don't just start fighting and create another war. And everyone's like, great idea, let's just carve it up. And sure, yeah, there wasn't a war for Africa specifically, like the war did kick off in Europe, but it is funny how the world is starting to think a little bit more of, we need to make decisions up front so we don't just start fighting over territory all the time, but then you just find another reason to start fighting over something else, and it all just kind of kicks off. But to double down on what you were saying on this nationalism thing, like even in Germany too, this, do you start to see the seeds of this Aryan kind of Prussian nationalism and deep anti-Semitism is already kicking into full gear at this point. And we all kind of know how that kind of climaxes in World War II. So it really is this, I hate to say it like this family dynamic where everybody's kind of at each other's throats, and then someone says a mean comment across the table, and that could be enough to kill 500,000 people in a war or something like that. It's just that's kind of, I think, the only way we can really wrap our heads around what's happening, because in your head, you're probably like, well, why would Germany and France just go to war over, nothing that's really concrete like World War II, where you have Hitler who's invading and he's, a madman and all of these sort of things. It's just like these little spats between family members that just blows up.
Well, I think that's a great point, right? And I think it kind of pivots to the next point that I was going to make, which is this period is also kind of characterized by this very intricate and complex geopolitical landscape where you're starting to see the balance of power and this kind of alliance system shift and evolve into what we're going to see in the more modern post World War I era. So if we look at like Europe's geopolitical landscape, it's kind of defined by this super delicate balance of power, and it's maintained through a complex network of alliances and treaties. So you have two major alliances, which is, the Triple Entente, France, Russia, and the UK. Then you have the Triple Alliance, which is Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. And these alliances were, somewhat defensive, but also reflected kind of mutual interests and shared concerns about the ambitions of rival power. So, the enemy of my enemy is my best friend. So, you kind of see that sentiment there.
And I think too with that is, we know that from World War I, but as you go back a decade, 2 decades, 3 decades before, roll some dice and those alliances are all going to be very different. Like we'll get into Bismarck and how he was able to get Germany and Russia to be allies for a period of time until Wilhelm kind of destroyed that relationship and moved his alliances over to the Austro-Hungarians. And again, if things kicked off at different times, we would be talking about a very, very different war. But like you were saying, there's these alliances that are all kind of made up with mutual interests in that point in time. But the interests are changing so rapidly that Germany's friends with someone one week and then next week they're friends with somebody else. And we've talked about this a lot. And when we always say, oh, it's this time period, when we talk about the time of like Napoleon and like the 1700s before that, I think this is like the final kind of piece to that, like almost the ending of that era, this, royal era of royal families kind of running everything, but also of that juggling around of alliances that seems to change, every couple of years based on marriages, based on little spats, all that kind of stuff. And so it is this just kind of bizarre world that just doesn't really seem to have any sort of stability. And I think, climaxes with World War I showing that, when you don't have any stability, this is what can happen.
Yeah, 100%. I think there's two kind of good examples that came out of my research that really do kind of really push that over the finish line, which is this kind of idea of this alliance system kind of falling apart. One, you have this example of like Russo-German relations at this time. So, super complicated. They fluctuated greatly during Wilhelm's reign. Initially they're a part of this kind of reassurance treaty, and then they failed to renew it, and then they kind of renew it again, and then Wilhelm's rule eventually led to Russia aligning more closely with France, which really did shift the power balance in Europe. You also have something we haven't really touched on yet is the Eastern question, which is really related to the Ottoman Empire. So this is a period of decline for the Ottoman Empire, and they're known as the sick man of Europe, or this kind of Eastern question. So essentially, what would happen to its territories? It created a bit of this geopolitical puzzle that involved all major powers seeking to expand their influence in the Balkans and the Middle East. And I think undercutting all of this is the impact of industrialization. So the Industrial Revolution has had a profound impact on military capabilities and strategies. Its output allowed nations to kind of equip these massive armies and build more advanced weapons, including battleships, machine guns, and later, tanks and aircrafts. And if you see one example of this would be a naval arms race. So a significant aspect of Wilhelm's reign was the naval arms race. So this kind of buildup of warships, particularly to kind of go against the United Kingdom, which we know is known for the strength of their naval fleet. So Wilhelm was fascinated with naval power and believed a strong navy was essential for Germany to assert itself as a world power. So this obviously led to the significant expansion of the German Navy, vis-a-vis the ability to do so through industrialization. But it prompted the British to increase their naval investments, kind of exacerbating the tensions between these two nations.
And I think with Germany too, they had the best land army in the world at that point, and everybody kind of knew that. And so to start dabbling with creating a better navy, and the British are like, hold on, that's our thing. You can't do that too, because we have to have the best navy to kind of control the seas. And then you have this alliance with Russia where you have the best army. Russia has an unbelievable amount of territory. I think I read somewhere it was 1/6 of the Earth's surface or something like that was covered by Russia at some point, which is how big their empire got.
Right.
And so you have all these little things where a Russian-German alliance can essentially dominate Europe, but then Britain's controlling the seas, and there's this balance that starts to come into play, and then it starts to change a little bit, and people don't like that. And then it starts to kind of grow and grow. So yeah, well, it'll be interesting as we get into his bio to really kind of see when he decides to change some of these alliances and when he decides to start building a navy. He's not necessarily thinking strategically. There's other forces at play here. So I think we'll get into that. But yeah, it's important to understand because there's, like I said, this fine balance, and so much is changing that, you tip things the scales in one direction, it's going to have 10, 20, 30 different things that it's going to impact downstream. And I don't think Wilhelm is someone we'd walk away from this podcast saying, yes, he's got someone who had really good foresight. And when he built his navy, he knew that this was going to happen, which is something we see with a lot of great leaders is they know what the consequences of their actions and they're very deliberate with them. We can't really say that about Wilhelm, and we'll see why as we move through this story.
Yeah. And I think if we're looking at some of the more broader themes, and not to kind of double down on this because I think we've discussed them at length, but in terms of like the more broader social and cultural changes, they're really brought upon by this domino effect of industrialization. So you're seeing increased urbanization, which leads to this change of social structures and class dynamics. So again, that shift away from the monarchy, you're seeing a reconfiguration of social hierarchies, but in tandem, you're also seeing these cultural and intellectual movements, which really do drive this kind of nationalistic sentiment across many populations. And I think if we're just trying to set the scene as a whole before we kind of get into his bio, I think there's a couple of, maybe there's like 2 or 3 points that I would like to make just to take it all the way home, which is under Wilhelm II, the German Empire undoubtedly surged at this kind of industrial military behemoth. It revolutionized its production and armed forces with cutting edge technology, which, again, was an output and byproduct of the Industrial Revolution and urbanization that's happening. And more broadly speaking, I think it's pretty fair to say Europe was a tinderbox of escalating tensions fueled by this nationalistic sentiment that is growing across Europe. You have a rampant buildup of arms across all these major forces, and you're going to caveat all of that with very ambitious imperialistic pursuits. So nations are essentially competing for global dominance with some heavy firepower, and they're scrambling to make sure that they're top in the hierarchy. And I think if you take away anything, that's probably a good way to look at the world that Kaiser Wilhelm II is kind of operating in.
And so what you're saying is if you're the person who's taking over Germany, you need to be on top of your game, a strong leader to avoid, collapse of Germany and potentially a massive war. So,
yes, sir.
Unfortunately, that's not the direction that Wilhelm is able to take. So I think let's jump into his bio, and it's a fascinating one because what we're really going to see here, and we joked a few episodes ago how we sometimes like to play amateur psychiatrist or psychologist. We're going to be doing that a little bit again today because you see when you look at like what Freud would say about how much of someone's life is dictated on what happens in their childhood. I think Kaiser Wilhelm is like a perfect example of that whole kind of overview of psychology. So when we look at Wilhelm, so he was born to Prince Frederick, who ended up becoming Frederick III, and Victoria, who is the eldest child of Queen Victoria. So like we said before, that Queen Victoria, so the Queen of England is his grandmother, because of all kind of the intermarrying that was happening throughout this time. But there's one thing about Kaiser Wilhelm that really kind of defines his life is he was born with a severely damaged left arm. The limb never grew to full size, and some historians have claimed this disability as a clue to understanding his behavior. So I've kind of written down here, this is the most important birth defect potentially in world history because the amount of attention that this arm gets is unbelievable. So we have to think of where he's being born into. He's being born into this Prussian society. And we talked a little bit about how there's this great military tradition. And so it's very similar to how you would think of, we talked about like Romans, right? They had this like really strong military tradition. If you weren't able to execute on the battlefield, you wouldn't have that credibility when it came to being a leader. And when we think of like all the stereotypes of Germany today, when we think of, industrial kind of getting stuff done, really efficient, that's more of a Prussian stereotype, quite frankly. Yep. So he's born into this world where he's expected to be a great leader militarily. He's supposed to be able to lead kind of with that iron fist and be very stern about everything. But to have a physical deformity, people aren't going to like that. And people are going to start questioning that. Can he really be this great Prussian leader with, an arm that doesn't work? How will he ride a horse? Will he be able to hold a sword? How will he be able to show off that he's this mighty leader? And that's all everybody thinks about. His parents, people around him. Queen Victoria is asking about it. So his parents are actually quite good. They are quite loving parents to him, which is kind of actually not the norm for the time. It's just this complex around him of people, within the court and within other European countries. And again, there's newspapers and magazines and all this stuff going out there where people are gossiping and talking about all of this stuff. So this is a big deal. So throughout his life, like I was saying, the short arm is at the center of everything. But his doctors, when he was younger, did everything in their power that they could to fix this problem. This does get it just gets weird. And we talked about this before and how like medical science at this point is just not in a good place. They're still,
it's hilarious.
Well, let's get into it. I have many examples here where you're going to be scratching your head. So from the age of 6 months, so we already know at this point that he's got this shorter arm and they're trying to fix it. So he's a 6-month-old baby, begins to undergo arcane but undeniably imaginative treatments intended to fix his damaged arm. Some treatments were inoffensively useless, so the arm was sprayed with seawater, it was massaged or wrapped in a cold compress. But there are others that are much more gruesome than this. So there's the practice of weekly, and I have it in quotes here, animal baths, which essentially required the arm to be shoved into the carcass of a freshly killed animal so that the heat might galvanize the shriveled tissue. So I know we're on audio here, but Richie's jaw has just hit the floor. So to put that in perspective, they're coming in with, hey, here's this badger that we killed, stuff your arm into this potentially diseased animal, and hopefully it will help stimulate growth in this arm. And he would do it once a week as a child who's not even 1 year old yet.
Oh man, I wonder what the rationale is there. Like
they wanted to galvanize the shriveled tissue. So I wonder if it's there's energy or the blood has some sort of thing. Like so that's not even all of it though. The other part that they did was the method of binding the prince's good arm to his body so that his left arm would, quote, have to work harder, did little to compromise. So it did nothing except it compromised his balance because he's got this arm strapped to his side so he can't balance himself. They also put him through electric shock therapy when he was almost about 1 year old. And then this is probably the worst one. He's a 4-year-old kid and they're putting him in a body stretching machine. So if you ever seen like the medieval torture device, like a rack, eventually just like trying to stretch his arm out. And again, like this isn't that long ago. This is late 1800s. We were talking about this before, like insulin's being invented. Antibiotics is 30, 40 years away. Germ theory is just being developed. But they're still doing this stuff. And it just reeks of desperation. Like if I'm a doctor at this time who knows, maybe at the top of their craft, they know none of this stuff is going to work. Sure. But what are you going to tell the prince or the emperor of Germany? Sorry, there's nothing we can do. That's just the way his arm's going to be. So you got to maybe make up all this stuff to try to make it look like you're doing something, or saying like, hey, what's the worst that can happen? Yeah, it's a really sad just beginning to his life because he's essentially being treated as something he's always been told there's something wrong with him through his entire life. And so he's not getting, the love that a child needs to grow. And he's, super self-conscious about this deformity really that everyone's telling him that he has.
Yeah, who wouldn't be? Especially given like his position in society too, right? Like he's kind of being groomed to be, the leader of Germany at some point in his life, and with all of the negative criticisms and I don't mean this to be a pun, but shortcomings. It's it's going to be quite difficult. Yeah,
and he's like we said this again the Prussian attitude of strong military leader, and there's not much love coming from the rest of the family when it comes to it's all right. He can accomplish what he needs to accomplish. He'll find a way to make it work. We'll make it work for him. There's something wrong with him. We need to fix him. And that's the most important thing. So as an adult, the Kaiser was semi-successful, I'll say, in hiding his shorter arm. So in pictures, he typically posed with his left hand resting on his sword with the right on top and gloves to provide like sort of a distraction so people wouldn't be looking at his arm. His clothes were actually tailored with higher pockets to disguise the length of his arm, and he grew adept at shooting and riding with his right arm. Historical videos show some movement in his left arm, and there was in the 1915 edition of Toronto World, which was an interesting little local take for us. So obviously this is during the war, so this is probably pure propaganda, but the Toronto World claimed that there was a series of strings and cords acting like muscles connected with the good muscles of his shoulder, enabling him to show, have movements that were kind of lifelike. So this is what people are talking about, right? This is such an amazing, a thing of, oh yeah, he's got this contraption just to be able to move his arm because he's just such a deformed, wrong person. And that's just who he is. And that's the most important thing about him. So he has, again, like there's all these influences around him. So he's already being told that he's deformed and broken and there's things that are wrong with him. But his mother is very, very loving, but she wants him to grow up as a proper British gentleman like her family. Yeah. And so she's always trying to push him into that direction. But he's also surrounded with this very Prussian attitude, which is not the same as kind of this traditional English gentleman. So he's in awe of his father as well. So his father was a war hero, for lack of a better term, where, you know, he was very key to helping with the unification of Germany. And, you know, Wilhelm like adores his father. He just wants to be like him so much. And he actually did have a close emotional relationship with his father, which is not really seen at the time, but it was definitely not encouraged. People would look at his father and him and be like, why are they so close? Like, that's the mother's job. You're supposed to be like, you know, kind of that stern father force. So there's a lot of give and take that was kind of happening there, but somebody good comes into his life. So at the age of 6, he's given a tutor who goes by the name of Ernst Hintzpeter, who really has a major impact on his life. And one of the great things that he does with Wilhelm is he takes him on a tour of Germany as a young kid. He's like, look, these are the people you're going to be ruling. Let's go to the factories. Let's go to the farms. Let's go to all the blue collar jobs and meet the people that you're actually going to be ruling one day. Which is like the complete opposite of when we looked at like Marie Antoinette and Louis, where, you know, they're sitting up in their palace, not thinking about the common man. Wilhelm's actually one of his good traits, and probably his best trait, is his ability to empathize, especially with the common man. So we definitely can't walk away from this saying, you know, Wilhelm's a sociopath or anything who just wanted this and that. He's a very, very compassionate person. And we'll see how he actually is a bit of a progressive when it comes to workers' rights and rights for the common man, compared to someone like von Bismarck, who was more of a, you know, stern conservative, you know, didn't really want to see things change from a, you know, social status perspective. So that kind of definitely helps him. And he kind of goes on later in life and writes that Hintzpeter had a really strong impact on his life. And he was someone who he really appreciated. But again, it still puts him through a lot of these, we'll say, quote unquote, trainings to get him to be, you know, a better leader and become the ruler that he really wants. And so, you know, part of that is his mother actually wants him to be able to ride a horse. And the way they train him to ride a horse is they put him on a horse. He falls off. They put him back on, falls off again. And they just keep repeating it until he eventually learns how to ride with his shorter arm. And again, like, he's a kid. You probably don't want this kid falling off horses all day, but to them, if your Kaiser can't ride a horse, what's the point, right? He needs to be a military leader, right? Yeah. And how's he going to look, you know, royal and powerful if he's not able to ride up on his horse in kind of a more royal standpoint? Or I'm not even sure what the word is, but have that majestic sense, right?
Yeah, no, it's such a great point, right? Like, I think there's it's almost like this like historical and present day tension that's happening between the shift that's going on that I kind of got into earlier. But to your point about him kind of, you know, learning about the people, the common folk, versus King Louis and Marie Antoinette, you know, this kind of diametric like opposition in a way. You know, you had King Louis and Marie Antoinette literally moved away from Paris, so they didn't have to see or deal with.
That's so true. It's a complete opposite, right? Like get as far away as they can. Yeah.
Yeah. But you're seeing Wilhelm with his tutor, essentially, you know, going out, connecting, seeing what the life of, you know, your everyday citizen is. And again, I think that kind of speaks to the broader theme that we touched on earlier, which is this urbanization that's happening, the social class that's kind of being reconfigured. So, you know, kudos to his tutor, because I think it would have been a grave mistake to kind of use and fall back on those, you know, more, I guess, traditional kind of traits of the monarchy. But you're also seeing it with the whole horse thing, right? Like, there is that sentiment that still is kind of entrenched and hanging on there, which is like, no, he's going to be the emperor of Germany. He needs to ride a horse. He has to look good, because that whole, you know, royal prestige and image is still very much well and alive. It is very much a society in transition in many ways. Yeah. And I think that's a very interesting example of it.
I think that's a great way to put it. And you're right. Like, the fact that his tutor's able to kind of understand that there's things that, you know, he needs to learn and grow to be able to become an emperor in this new world. But at the end of the day, there's deal breakers. Can't ride a horse. Yep. So this whole thing's going to get really, really challenging. So, you know, he really did resist attempts by his parents, like especially his mother, like to educate him in this British liberalism kind of idea. He really focused more on where his tutor and also other people around him to support this, I guess, more autocratic rule, gradually putting him into more this, I guess you could call it like Prussianized is the word that I got written down here, where he's just like trying to be that strong, capable leader, kind of no nonsense kind of guy who's, able to have a certain tone when he speaks and kind of walks in a certain way and has all these things that when you look at someone, you go, yeah, that's a proper Prussian leader right there. Like that's kind of the vibe that he's trying to go for. And eventually part of that is he has to join the military. So he ends up joining the military as a lieutenant. And Wilhelm says about the military, he says, I really found my family, my friends, and my interest. Everything of which I had up to that point, I had to do without. So this is, I think, the first time in his life where we really see meaning, right? He's able to say, I'm not just being groomed to be this emperor. I'm here and I understand that there's a common goal that we're all trying to accomplish. So he's always had this like polite and agreeable demeanor. But again, like he's being that Prussianized kind of element is starting to continue here. And it's really coming through in the military. However, the really big problem here is he loves the military because of what it represents, doesn't have really any interest in doing what the military does, fighting, but in his case, tactics, strategy. He really doesn't have any interest in that. Some people kind of said he just liked to dress up in military attire, march around, point at things. And I don't blame him because this is the first time in his life where people aren't questioning who he is, how he looks. He's a lieutenant, he's a commanding officer. People are going to show him respect and he's going to be able to feel like I have all of this control and power. So I can see where it comes from. But again, this is very, very bad if you want this person to take you into this new world where war can break out at any moment and your emperor has really no interest in tactics. He just wants to wear the uniform, wear the helmet and march around all day.
You think his family knew that? I'm just curious. Like, I know we're going to get into his decision-making and leadership traits, but, I think for our listeners, probably worthwhile to mention at times that I didn't do any research on the biography, like tangentially through the context, yes, but I didn't know that about Kaiser Wilhelm II, that he wasn't really all that interested in the actual meatiness of military training, but more so like the image and the accolades that came with it. I wonder how his family felt about that.
So I don't know what his family specifically would have thought, but everybody around him, who knew very, very clearly that, well, this guy's going to become emperor and that kind of sucks, but what are we going to do about it? He's the son of our current emperor, or the grandson at the time. He's going to be emperor and there's nothing we can do about it. So, it's not going to be good, but we'll find a way to make it work. And it's kind of a sad reality, but I think people realized very early on that the attitude of this kid and young man was not heading in a good direction. And there probably wasn't much they could do to really, change that course. That's just kind of who he was. So
it's also a bit of foreshadowing though, right? As we'll get into some of his like leadership and decision making, but it seems like maybe this is like an early example or an earlier example from like adolescence where he's not necessarily interested in like the nuances or the details of getting too into things, but surface level thinking may be a good way to kind of characterize some of his later policy decisions and approaches.
Definitely. Yeah. And I think now as we move on with his life, Bismarck, who is the great unifier of Germany, starts to have more of an influence on his life. And, we start to see Bismarck almost kind of using Wilhelm as a bit of a tool to kind of, I wouldn't say use him for his own gain in that sense necessarily, but starting to separate him from his parents and kind of bring him more into the government and try to bring him into the Bismarck way of thinking. And so some of the things that Bismarck was able to do, and we talked about that Russian-German alliance. And one thing I just want to kind of mention here is, if Russia's got the best military and Russia's got the most territory, Germany's got the best military, Germany's not going to war with any major European power unless they decide that they want to. Britain, France, Italy, nobody's going to mess with Germany if they have the backing of the Russians. And so this almost guarantees some level of peace for Germany at this time, if they want it. So there's this, Bismarck's done all this great work to really get Germany to this place. And he sees that Wilhelm is coming along. And he goes, I need to get him involved in some foreign policy. So he starts sending him on different diplomatic missions. We'll see how later in life this gets even worse, but that he's sent to Russia, he's sent to other places to, be the ambassador for Germany. And he just has this terrible reputation now around Europe for just fumbling international relations, being disrespectful, just not really understanding what his job is supposed to be. He's just kind of just there and kind of saying what's on his mind and not really understanding how to do any sort of diplomacy. Now, again, was he poorly trained in that sense, or is he just kind of a lost cause at this point? And that's just the way he's going to be. Well, we don't really know for sure, but he's in his 20s now, right? He's not like some young guy. Like he ends up becoming emperor at 29. So this isn't like some guy who becomes emperor at 18 and, right? He's still kind of getting up there in age. He's 29. He's more seasoned at this point. But yeah, it's not a good start to his international relations. And then when he becomes emperor, people start to look at this and go, oh boy, this guy's in charge. This isn't going to end well. And so one of those, just before he becomes emperor, just one point I wanted to bring up is his hatred for England. We've already kind of mentioned this. It starts to grow and grow. So he basically doesn't trust his mother a lot now because she's trying to push him more into this English way of living life and becoming a gentleman, where he wants to be very Prussian like his father. So there's a thing that I have here that at some point in his life, he angrily implied that, quote, an English doctor killed my father and an English doctor crippled my arm, which was the fault of my mother, who allowed no German physicist to attend to herself or her immediate family when she was still alive. So he's got, this is later in life. This is just to kind of say, this is where his mindset kind of gets encapsulated around that everything English is bad, everything German is good. Thus, going to war and 20 years later isn't going to be the most crazy thing. But let's get into his reign as emperor. So his father actually only reigns for a few months. So his grandfather passes away. His father takes over for, I think it was like 80 or 90 days or something like that, passes away quite quickly. And Wilhelm becomes emperor at 29. So two big things kind of happen during his reign. So we teased a bit about his international relations, which we'll get into, but the removal of Otto von Bismarck as chancellor. So we already just talked, we hyped him up, right? He's the guy who brought Germany together. He's created this spectacular alliance for Germany that's really going to ensure that there's peace. But Bismarck's careful. He doesn't want to rock the boat. He doesn't want to look as being an expansionist power. He wants to slowly build into things. And again, look at Wilhelm. He's this great Prussian general who's going to bring great wealth to Germany and great victories on the battlefield. And you need to be expansionist to be able to do that. And he's already at odds now with Bismarck, because Bismarck is like, let's take it easy. We'll take territory where it makes sense, but we're not going to ruffle any feathers. Where Wilhelm is more, I want to be part of this greater expansion of Germany. So he resists that, and he kind of starts plotting with some senior generals who are, you think of like the war junkie kind of general who just, they love war. That's all they want to do. And so he starts to get this relationship with those generals, and Bismarck is, starting to be pushed aside a little bit. And at one point, Bismarck told an aide that, quote, the young man, being Wilhelm, wants war with Russia and would like to draw his sword straight away if he could. And I shall not be any part to that. So Bismarck is saying something bad's going to happen. And I know I can't be part of this, because like if this goes too far, this is going to be a problem. And the one last thing I'll say on just kind of that conversation on decision making is Bismarck and other people around him would say that Wilhelm commonly agreed with the last person he spoke with. His mind would jump around so quickly. So Bismarck would say, look, let's not mess around with Russia. Let's make sure that they're a really strong alliance. And then he talks to a general after. He's like, we could win a war in 6 months and we would take all this territory. And Wilhelm's like, oh yeah, it's actually a great idea. And then he talks to Bismarck again, and Bismarck's like, wait a second, I thought we just talked about this. So he's jumping around. He's got all these ideas. He doesn't have the ability to stop and think and put a proper strategy together. He's just kind of an ideas man. He's got all these ideas that he wants to try out, but he doesn't really understand that, all the work that Bismarck has put into kind of put his stamp on things. He doesn't really maybe respect that, or doesn't agree with it, or just is so insecure in himself that he sees that war is the only way to make him feel, like a proper gentleman, a proper emperor.
Well, this is the thing too, right? Like, I definitely believe that Otto von Bismarck definitely demands his own episode, Paul. But like, this is the Iron Chancellor we're talking about. This is the architect of so many key treaties and political alliances. He has kind of very successfully been able to wade this very steadfast, strategic series of alliances. He's been able to handle other alliances. He's kind of like at the center of it all leading up to Wilhelm. Like, his position leading up to the reign of Wilhelm, I don't think it can be understated, the importance of his role in kind of being this architect that shaped the geopolitical landscape pre-Wilhelm. And then to, obviously go against someone who has been such a stalwart in this era really does speak to maybe not necessarily speak to, but kind of diminish any kind of actual decision making or, critical analysis on the behalf of Wilhelm.
Yeah, I think so. And it's interesting now because I'm just kind of thinking reading down my notes here, and the next thing that kind of comes up is, we've just hyped up Bismarck as being so good with foreign policy and Wilhelm being so terrible. And you're like, you know what? You may be coming away from this saying Bismarck was this great man who did everything well, and Wilhelm was just this bum who couldn't do anything. But now kind of the next point is where it kind of flips on its head a little bit. So Bismarck is trying to pass really anti-socialist laws. He wants to block all labor reforms. He really doesn't want kind of that workers' rights. Communism really there's no Russian Revolution yet. So it's not this Red Scare in the same sense that we saw around the world. But those ideas are starting to propagate, and he's trying to push back and really block any ideas that don't go with kind of his conservative view of things. But Wilhelm is against this. Wilhelm says, I'm going to support, there was a big strike, and Bismarck is obviously backing all of the employers and the companies and saying, we're going to support you. This is, we can't have these strikes. But Wilhelm steps in and goes, actually, no, I'm going to support the workers on this. They need someone to stand up for them. And so when you look at that, you go, my goodness, that's massive thing for a world leader at that time to be standing 100%. Up for the working man. He might be one of the first to actually do that as a head of state, which I thought was really, really interesting. It's just a shame for Wilhelm that this all kind of happens, around where those are great things. If this was just peacetime and Wilhelm never had to go down kind of that war path, we might talk of him as a great innovator, as a person who was able to, maybe since he thought a little bit differently, he was able to empathize with the common man, especially for someone like himself who was somebody who had to go through a lot of hardships. Yep. But unfortunately, that's not what happens. And Bismarck and Wilhelm are just at each other's throats at this point. And Bismarck is basically on the cusp of being fired or relieved of his position, but he ends up resigning and basically saying, I can no longer work with the emperor. And I have one quote here that Bismarck said about he said early on in Wilhelm's life, so more so when he was like a kid and maybe into his teenage years. He said, quote, Wilhelm wanted every day to be his birthday, romantic, sentimental, and theatrical, unsure and arrogant, with an immeasurable, exaggerated self-confidence and a desire to show off, a juvenile cadet who never took the tone of the officer's mess out of his voice, and brashly wanted to play the part of supreme warlord, full of panicky fears of monotonous life without any diversions, and yet aimless, pathological in his hatred against his English mother.
Mic drop.
Seriously.
Wow.
So tell us how you really feel of Bismarck, right?
Could you imagine reading if someone wrote that about you? Oh man.
Yeah.
That's powerful.
Yeah. That just goes to show what a lot of people who were around Wilhelm kind of thought of him coming up in this world. And you can see why they didn't get along, especially if you're thinking about him in that sense. And it doesn't seem like that sort of attitude really went away as he became emperor. So I'm going to go through a couple of things here just on his international relations. We'll wrap up his life real quick because after kind of World War I, there's nothing too interesting. And then maybe spend a few minutes going through his, we've already kind of talked from some of his leadership traits, but we'll kind of wrap everything up. So I really need to talk about his international relations. So he's emperor, and there's about 3 or 4 things here where he does that are just absolute boneheaded decisions that starts to undo all the things that Bismarck and all the people around him did to really create these strong international relations with Germany. So the first is, like you've mentioned, expanding the Navy without really having good relations with England at that time. And England saw that as a direct threat because England is an island. They have a great Navy. If Germany's building a Navy, why are they building such a big Navy? Do they want to control the seas? Sure. They control the North, they border the North Sea. Can they control the passages through the Scandinavian countries and into Russia? One other thing he did was during the Second Boer War in South Africa. So this is essentially a rebellion within British-owned South Africa. He sends a telegram to Paul Kruger, who is the president of this breakaway republic. And he said, he started by saying, my good friend Paul. And then he offered moral support to the Boers against the British, which further kind of strained relationships against Germany and the United Kingdom. Like, why is he sending this to a breakaway nation saying, oh, good job, guys. I'm giving you my moral support. A bit strange, especially when,
Very
England
strange.
I guess part of his hatred for England, I'm sure, is coming up, but he doesn't have the ability to get past that and think, okay, here's my, international relationship and what's best for my country. Next is with Russia. So he sent a telegram to his cousin, Tsar Nicholas II of Russia, during the Russian-Japanese War, which the Japanese actually end up winning, and is one of the key parts on why Tsar Nicholas was overthrown, is he addressed Nicholas as Nicky, which again, this is the Tsar. You need to be professional. He says, I rejoice at the happy ending and trust that in God, and he will give you your exhausted troops strength to complete their glorious mission, which kind of was, you're like almost saying like, great, the war is over. Now your troops get to relax, but they've just lost the war against the Japanese, and the Russian court was not too happy about that. And that kind of started on the path towards the Russia-German relationship kind of breaking apart. He called it the scrap of paper comment. So at the onset of World War I, Wilhelm referred to the 1839 Treaty of London, which guaranteed Belgian neutrality as a scrap of paper. This dismissive comment infuriated the British public and played a role in Britain's decision to join the war against Germany. And then there was some things too with him going to Morocco and supporting Moroccan independence and trying to, just because it was going to support the French, which was going to annoy the British, but then it all kind of came back around and the French ended up getting what he wanted. So it accomplished nothing, but he just annoyed everybody else. And then finally he decides, I'm going to become a really good ally with the really weak Austro-Hungarian Empire. So one thing I've kind of learned through this research is during World War I, we see Austria-Hungary as part of the Axis powers, but they're not doing as much as Germany. Like Germany is really the workhorse of this alliance. So he, becomes allies with Austria-Hungary, and then Archduke Franz Ferdinand gets assassinated, and that kicks off this whole war. So all of these sort of things come together of just annoying everybody in Europe, allying yourself with an empire that you probably don't need to ally yourself with, and then jumping in right away to that war, and then going through Belgium to, break this Belgian neutrality pact. So that's just a lot of things that's happening with Wilhelm. But again, it doesn't set the scene for really good. It doesn't put Germany in a spot where, they're able to kind of maneuver their way politically around World War I. It's essentially war or bust at this point for them.
The examples you just walked through, Paul, I don't know why this sticks out to me the most, but the letter providing moral support during the Boer War is probably, to me, one of the strangest. Like, why moral support? If you really want to give it to the British, why not help the war effort on one front or the other, right? There's almost this like childlike impulsiveness that's there.
Absolutely. And I think that's what, when we look at Bismarck's damning quotation of Wilhelm, you're right, it's childish, it's impulsive. It's, what's the first thing that comes to my mind? What can I do is like, what would a high school kid do to get back at somebody? Like, that's 100%. What he's doing, right? He's treating this like a spat over, nothing, but he's, these are massive countries that are, have these people who have been in charge for 30, 40 years doing international diplomacy. And then to see stuff like this, it's like, well, he's clearly unhinged, which means I don't know if I really even want to be allied with this guy, right? Because what the heck is he going to do next? So you're right. I think childish is unfortunately probably the most apt term to describe him at this point.
Yeah, I think just kind of thinking through some of those examples, like it just seems the shift from someone like, Bismarck to Wilhelm, quite the stark contrast. And, we've laid out like the geopolitical landscape, and maybe this is a good opportunity to kind of pivot to, what we think of as like leadership and decision making. You might already have a good sense if you're listening as to what we might think.
We played our hand very, very early today, but maybe Richie, before we get into that, let's just wrap up his life real quick, because there's a couple just interesting points, but we'll go through them real quick and then we'll get into that. So like I said, World War I kicks off, Germany invades through Belgium, everything happens, World War I ends. He doesn't really do anything during World War I. Again, at this point, it's wartime. People realize he's not really bringing much value. And so Germany is essentially run through the bureaucracy that is the German military and the German government. But at the end of the war, the German military is in pretty much full revolt. And so one of the things is heads need to roll at this point. So Wilhelm's head doesn't roll in the strictest definition, but he's basically forced to abdicate his throne and really end the royal monarchy of Germany. And he flees into exile and ends up living the rest of his life in the Netherlands, where he dies in 1941, which, for those who know European history and why that date is so important, is he actually dies under Nazi occupation, which I think is quite fascinating, because he actually supported the Nazis' rise to power. And again, this just shows that even later in his life, he doesn't understand people very well, and he doesn't really have the foresight. He sees the Nazis rising to power and he goes, you know what, this might be good for me, because maybe if they take over, they're going to want to restore the monarchy and I'm going to come back into power. Do you know who Adolf Hitler is? Have you heard anything that this guy says?
Yeah.
He's more than a monarch in his own eyes. He's basically a god, and he hates you. He hates the German government during World War I. He blames the Jews for a lot of things, but he also blames Wilhelm and
Weak
the
government.
entire apparatus. Yeah, exactly.
Weak government is what led to the reparations that totally handcuffed Germany for years.
Exactly. So he's all excited about the Nazis coming to power. Then he realizes very quickly that that's not going to happen, and he changes his tune and isn't a huge fan. But he's able to live somewhat peacefully in the Netherlands until his death and dies under Nazi occupation. So again, just a kind of a boring end to his life, and kind of a lot of his own doing. But I think to get into, like you said, some of his leadership decisions, they're just baffling from start to finish from an international relationship perspective. But again, we see, is it foresight when it comes to, being a little bit more progressive around workers' rights and understanding that that's going to be an important piece? Or was that more just, I'm able to empathize with them because I have this, I've been told there's something wrong with me. I've gone through all of these hardships and I don't want anyone to kind of go through the same thing. And there's more of an empathetic kind of relationship. I don't know if we'll know for sure, but I don't know if I can walk away from this saying that really Wilhelm, he's not showing it anywhere else in life. So I don't really know if I can walk away and say, yes, he had some really good foresight in maybe these specific areas of his life. I don't know if you kind of think the same.
I would totally agree with you, Paul. So
right.
I would like to think, there's like one component of him and his leadership and his decision making where, he does have that more empathetic quality. But given everything else we talked about in the context that we've talked about it, I think really this is probably just a coincidence that he's, maybe he sees something in those people, the everyday common folk that he will be governing over, and thinks, maybe he treats it as a bit of a popularity contest, and, maybe they'll like me more because I treat them nice. I wasn't treated nice. Maybe it's something along those lines. But I think if you isolate that particular positive thing that we've taken up from this conversation, the rest of it, to me, I think, and again, I will caveat my analysis with the reality that the geopolitical landscape at this time is extremely fascinating, but it is extremely complicated. But based on the way he acted and behaved, I do not believe that he had the aptitude to do so. It seems like he was very inconsistent, very impulsive, easily swayed, and didn't really make decisions while considering the long-term impacts or even midterm impacts of what he's actually signing off for at the end of the day.
Yeah, I think kind of as you're talking there, like the piece of where you were saying he's easily swayed, I think is the best way to kind of think about him, because it's this, how would I put this? He's almost like he's trying to be a people pleaser. Like when Bismarck was saying, he would talk to me and then he would go talk to somebody else and he's completely changed his mind. Like everything that he does is for this validation that he so desperately craves. And again, to go back to that like Freudian analysis, like he didn't have any of that as a kid. He didn't really have the love that a kid should have. And then he just doesn't have also the other part where everyone's also praising him all the time because he's an emperor, he's a royal. So he's like, in one sense, he's being told that he's just not good enough all the time for something that's out of his control. But then for things that are fully in his control, he's being told, oh yeah, you're doing great. You're the best. Everything is great. You don't have to change anything about yourself. And I think you put the two together, you develop this massive insecurity around who you are as a person, but then you also have this massive arrogance of who you are as a person. And then you bring the two together, and I think you get Kaiser Wilhelm. Like I don't really know any other way to put it.
That's just, you nailed it.
Yeah, it's two elements, right, coming together.
Yeah, I think you nailed it. The insecurity part, I was actually thinking it right before you said it. I think this kind of screams to me some of the tropes of a person who's dealing with some severe insecurity around not being able to make decisions in a way that align with what their actual thoughts or motives are. And I think that kind of goes back to the whole easily swayed thing.
Yeah.
I think when we look at good leaders, if we contrast this quickly with good leaders, there's always a sense of direction in alignment with, their values, what's right, what's wrong, the impact on the, breadth of the population that it's going to impact, foresight, strategic decision making as to, is this actually going to create a greater good or stop a net negative from happening? And I think we're looking at some of his political relations, and there is not one iota of an example that kind of actually showcases any of that.
You're right. And I think when we look at all the great leaders, we never look at a leader and say them individually were so perfect and they made all of the decisions. There's always, they had a really great second in command, or they had really good good people around him, or they were really good at identifying good talent to bring around them and to be able to get people together and work hard and figure out problems. With someone like Wilhelm, you have someone like Bismarck, who's clearly very, very intelligent. You may disagree with him on certain things. And again, That's politics. It's going to happen, but we don't really see anybody saying good things about him. And he's very similar to Commodus, and is kind of the way I'm thinking about it too, is, I think definitely Wilhelm's more of a compassionate person. But the thing with Commodus was he was putting his friends in power, bringing a lot of yes men in, people who are going to tell him the things that he wants to hear because it's easy. And I see that a lot with Wilhelm. But I think with Wilhelm, the thing is we do understand a lot more about his life, and we can kind of trace it back to how he was brought up. With Commodus, we're kind of guessing a little bit just based on what we know from a historical standpoint. So yeah, it's tough because you want to empathize with him because a lot of this stuff really isn't his fault. He was just raised very, very poorly. But at the end of the day, he's got a lot of blood on his hands. The number of bodies that are racked up under his empire is quite high. So, I don't think we can ever walk away. We never walk away and say someone's ultimately good or bad. But I think with him, there's just, you can empathize with him, I think, a lot more than you can with other emperors or dictators who have, millions of bodies kind of on their hands. So yeah, I think that's kind of how I'm kind of walking away from this. Is it's a sad ending, but one that I can empathize with, just because he was dealt a great hand being emperor and being born into that family, but he was dealt a terrible hand with, his shorter arm, which caused way more issues than it ever should have. And, the entire apparatus that was around him from an international perspective, but also the people around him.
Yeah. I think for me, walking away from this, there's definitely this idea of someone who's very ambitious and hungry and kind of wants to do the right thing. But a lot of the actual execution and tactics used to execute are misplaced and seem to do more harm than good at the end of the day.
Yeah, I think that's a perfect way to put it. He's someone I think we're going to think about a lot as I think we move along, and we're going to say, I see a little Wilhelm in this person, or they were moving, they should have ended up like Wilhelm, but something happened in their life where they weren't able to, and then, able to pivot into maybe a bit of a stronger leader. So yeah, I think this was a really fascinating episode. He had a very, very fascinating life. And yeah, like I said, we're going to come back to him, I'm sure, more than once. And we have, I think, a few other people that have come away from this that are probably going to deserve their own episodes. So yeah, we'll be back with more of those. And thank you all for listening, and we will be back with another episode next time.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you for listening to today's episode of the History in Motion podcast. If you enjoyed our journey through time, please subscribe, rate us, and share the podcast with friends. Your support helps keep history alive. Until next time.